All right, I do plan to come back and get Slavoj Žižek. I will, after post Jameson. But right now, let's talk about, and there's not too many episodes left. I don't want to do this, for 40, 50 episodes. Although I could. There's lots of totalitarians in Western philosophy. Let's talk about this book, though. And, I'm not going to. I've got some misgivings about including this in this series. I do think it fits, but it expresses misgivings about itself in an interesting way. Pierre Bourdieu's On the State. Lectures at the Collège de France, 1989 to 1992. All right, so it's Pierre Bourdieu is a sociologist. I'm happy to regard him as a political theorist, though, too, or a political philosopher. And, this book, like lots of his books, although really the only book I've really read in full of Pierre Bourdieu before is Distinction, his work on the sociology of aesthetics, which is fascinating and fundamental, too. Like, not to say that every word is inevitable or something, but Pierre Bourdieu's Distinction is really an important book. An important book in sociology and an important book in aesthetics, too. Basically arguing that in a qualified Marxist way, I guess, that social class determines taste, which is not exactly, or, social class conditions taste. And that's not that shocking of a conclusion, although the way he does it might make you get worried about your own tastes and your own class, which is pretty impressive, I guess, if a book forces you to self-reflect. But then, the way he develops it, though, sociologically and like with real information and with real ingeniousness and with real writerliness too, man. Like he's awfully good in a variety of dimensions. Pierre Bourdieu. And this book is really interesting. And in the course of reading this book, I've become more and more fascinated with Bourdieu. And so I'm just not going to do a straight up slam like I would on Jameson, okay, or whatever. Like I think there's a lot of really fascinating, redeeming stuff in here, actually, and Bourdieu's whole approach. Now, on the other hand, the conception of the state that he gives here is Hegel totalitarian, in my opinion. And one thing that we just can't forget is that Hegel's everywhere, man. Like there's no escaping Hegel. This really is, the account of the state in this book, I feel, is very Hegelian, which is a little bit odd if you're a sociologist, because that's a very a priori set of moves that Hegel is engaged in. Bourdieu, I think this is pretty damn French too, and he's really into the French case, the case of France. He regards the state as the universal. I mean, he says that over and over again. Now, who says that? The state is the universal. Now, I don't know what that means, really. I think it's a bunch of bullshit, actually. All right, the state is the universal. The universal is the universal. The particular is the universal. The state is the particular. I don't know, man. We're just yapping. But that is his position. And we could try to say what that means a little bit. All right, so we'll start with a Weber conception of the state as a monopoly of violence over a population. But it's what Bourdieu focuses on in that definition, which I omitted when I just said it, is the legitimate violence. A state is a monopoly of legitimate violence. Now that brings in elements of Bourdieu's most basic concepts, like cultural capital, right? Symbolic capital. These are attempts to extend or invert Marxism, okay? He claims to be a materialist, sort of on and off, but I think he's really the opposite of a Marxist materialist in a lot of ways. Although, we can argue about whether this is in Marx somehow, or it's certainly in Marxism as it develops. All right, so Bourdieu defines the state as a concentration of various forms of capital, including like physical means of production and physical means of material production, a la Marx, but then also symbolic, cultural capital, etc. And those are the things he focuses on. And the construction, the use of cultural capital by the state is precisely this construction of the universal, and we cannot conceive of the human without that universal. And this is so Hegel, okay? It makes the state into apparently a bottom line condition of human life, and it sort of sucks you into the idea that it's going to be doing everything, and it definitely wants the state doing your thinking for you or so. But now with Bourdieu, and as a sociologist, I'm a little worried about this. Is the project, and I would say like he wrestles with this, but does he nail it? Does he say clearly? Is this basically a descriptive project, or is it basically a normative project? So he could be describing the function of the state in our, quote, our, unquote, consciousness. Like we, quote, unquote, the citizens of France, I guess, think of the state, sort of like Hegel thought of the state, as the universal, as universally valid, as defining all the people within the state and telling them who they are and what their roles are and educating them and all this stuff, okay? And making it absolutely central to every aspect of human life, even where it doesn't seem to be present. And this is, and to the point where the state and the people, they seem to be merging, or they're inconceivable without one another and stuff like this. And, it's Hegel-Rousseau. But again, like, is this on the sociological level? Is he trying to say this is how we, French people, think about the state? What he emphasizes is all these universal functions of the state. Although they're universal functions of the French state, but not the universal functions of many other states. So, for example, standardized spelling, official language, and standardized spelling. Those are things he regards as central emblems of state power. Like this shows you the universal function of the state, and also the very basic social function. Like we couldn't really hardly communicate without the state, actually, right? Because the state standardizes the language, and it's standardized, and it does in France, sort of. Although I would just hit the slang and hit it hard. But anyway. Or just bastardize French with other languages at will. Good luck resisting that, really, government of France. But anyway, they'd have to some extent. Or like weights and measures. That's the function of government, to standardize weights and measures. And these are applications of the most pervasive applications of symbolic capital. But again, is it descriptive or normative? Does he think this is what a state should be? Or is he just saying that this is how we think about it? We think about it as if we were baby Hegels. Over and over again, as I read this, I have to say, like, well, I don't think about it that way at all. What are you talking about, man? The state is universal for us. Well, I don't know, whatever. But let's, okay, so let's look at a couple of these things. All right, let's see. Where's my spot? I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble finding where I wanted to go. Wow, I thought I had the spot I wanted, but I don't. All right, let's try this. This is the standard weights and measures imposed by the state uh, are not just an instrument to make measuring possible, enabling those who govern to know the governed. The categories are also legitimate ones. A nomos, a law, a principle of division that is universally recognized within the limits of society, about which no discussion is needed. It's printed on one's identity card. Occupational categories, like of a census, or on the pay slip which says third grade such and such a point on the scale. I guess they do that in France, but we don't do it here. But anyway, people are quantified and coded by the state. They have a state identity. The functions of the state clearly include the production of legitimate social identity. In other words, even if we do not agree with these identities, we have to put up with them. That's one of the major explanatory principles in sociology. Individuals who have difficulties with the educational system are often determined by their very difficulties. And certain intellectual careers are entirely determined by an unfortunate relationship with the educational system. I wonder who he has in mind. That could certainly be me, though. Maybe he's talking about Michel Foucault or something. That is, by an effort to give the lie without knowing it to a legitimate identity imposed by the state. The state is a well-founded illusion, he says. All right, man. All right. I'm tempted to go, a well-founded illusion, eh? Well, it's an illusion, so let's just puncture it. But it's a necessary illusion, and illusions can be cultural capital. That is one of the major explanatory principles in sociology. This page 10. Individuals who have difficulties with I already said that. The state is a well-founded illusion. This mysterious reality, this mysterious reality exists through its effects and through the collective belief in its existence. It is something that you cannot lay your hands on or tackle in the way people from the Marxist tradition do when they say the state does this, the state does that. By way of preamble, what I want to say is, be careful. All sentences that have the state as subject are theological sentences, which does not mean they're false, although he just said the state is an illusion, inasmuch as the state is a theological entity, that is an entity which exists by way of belief. Now, Pierre Bourdieu does claim to be a materialist. But that's a pretty odd materialism if things exist by being believed, right? If you make fictions real by collective belief in them. And the relentless emphasis is on Weberian legitimacy, like we're defining the state as the legitimate monopoly of force over a population. And everything in Bourdieu's intellectual arsenal gets inserted into that word legitimate. That's where the social, spiritual, cultural capital is lodged. It's the monopoly of violence is one thing. It's the legitimacy. And the fact and the way he thinks about the legitimacy is that people obey even when they don't have to, kind of like people are much more obedient than the physical force involved would entail. Right? Like people think of it as legitimate. Again, the question is like, are we doing philosophy or sociology in a way? Like people necessarily think of the state, do they though, as legitimate violence. And then Bourdieu can use that as a kind of wedge to go way out. And the way he defines a state is as an accumulation of capital of various kinds, symbolic, material, cultural, and so on. The legitimate accumulation of all capital and power. Are we sure we want that? All right, so all forms of capital flow toward the state. And I think that's a pretty totalitarian vision right there. Like, all the cultural capital is dependent on state power, and all the categories, and your identity, and your language, and your weights and measures and the objects in your environment and so on. It's very, very Hegelian. And he goes on and on in that vein. The state as the universal, the state as the viewpoint on viewpoints. But he also, that's a very, very general Hegelian position that he sketches out, although, is it descriptive or normative? And I think that that's in tension with the sociological approach. Like, that's an awfully a priori conceptual equipment from 200 years ago approach to the empirical data, that the state is the universal. Does that emerge from sociology, an assertion like that? I don't see how it could, I guess. Let's put it that way. But he's really very interesting on the descriptive normative distinction, and he works it really hard and really elaborately. And I don't want to underestimate this kind of amazing book. So that's one reason I kind of hesitate to slam Bourdieu as a totalitarian. Is he saying, either way this is a problem, but is he saying that we think of a state as a total institution, defining our language, our world, and ourselves? Or is he saying the state should be a total institution, defining your world, your language, yourself? Both of those are false, but but it's not clear which one he's doing. But okay, so that maybe takes a little of the sting out. Like, he's not a pure philosopher. He's trying to talk about the way this thing really works, and he does do a lot of work to show that. Referring to all kinds of literature, and then also, especially sociology, but also describing some of his own sociological studies. For example, on the function of commissions in the state. And then here's also, I guess, a moment that gives me pause, and that I think it's an amazing moment. And I wish it was more than a moment. And I wish that many people had moments like this. Many great intellectuals have moments like this in their work. Right? And this is I guess I'm just going to read a paragraph and describe this, but he's much more self-reflective than any figure that we've seen, I think, actually. Really. All right. So he really is worried about his own techniques, and he's worried about his own conclusions. And he's worried about what he's conveying to his students a little bit. But that doesn't keep him from putting it forward and developing it empirically. But then suddenly you'll get this moment of self-reflection that is stunning, really. And so this is the way he ends one of these lectures. This is on page 161, the lecture of 31 January 1991. After having worked a lot on the state, this is the way he ends it up. And this is the lecture, this is one of the lectures where he's basically trying to define what a state is by the coincidence of forms of capital and capital accumulations. After having worked a lot on the state, rereading today my article on symbolic power, and maybe we should talk about this, he's constantly referring to his own piece on symbolic power in here. Can I say I'm a little worried about symbolic power, and especially about things like symbolic violence and shit like this? I guess I'm going to say something to you, man. Go ahead and do symbolic violence to me. All right? All right? As long as you don't touch me, man, as long as you don't do any physical violence to me, I think I'm going to be all right. Fucker. So, I guess I think cultural capital, I guess people think of him as a Marxist, Bourdieu. Maybe a reverse of Marxism. Like he reverses the base and superstructure relationship very dramatically. I mean, I think he thinks cultural capital, whatever that is exactly, representations or cultural prestige and things like this, are more fundamental than material capital. He calls himself a materialist, and he's really worried that he's going to be accused of idealism. I see why. Okay, I really think he's going back to Hegel. Like that's a Hegel state. It's a priori Hegel state, and all right. So but like I say, like the self-reflection and self-doubts are kind of astounding for an intellectual working at this level, like a really major intellectual figure. And so he says this, like I say, like this moment where he's kind of finished his discussion of the state, and he's looking back on his own work, or he's finishing maybe his definition of the state in Weber terms and expanding on Weber and reversing Marx. I think he is kind of the reverse of a Marxist. But I mean, the whole history of Marxism, I mean, one central feature of the whole history of Marxism after Marx is that dealing with this materialism thing. And, lots of people sort of took a century to flip it over completely so that, the superstructure determines the base. And I do think that's Bourdieu's position. The superstructure, the symbolic level, the institutions, the religion, the arts and stuff, create and fundamentally condition the material production. Well, in some ways it's hard to see how you could get farther from Marx, especially while expressing your devotion, I guess. But maybe he's not that worried about that. I mean, there's this 100-year history, like I say, including people like Adorno or whatever, Benjamin, or Gramsci, where they slowly make this reversal step, I guess. That doesn't leave you as a Marxist, so if you ask me, man, and it abandons the basic, the most important, the most fundamental insight of Marxism, which is that this is a material reality, dude, and there's a lot of yip yap, and a lot of propaganda and shit like that. But what's really happening is the economic shit at the material level. That's not Bourdieu's position. But he comes awfully close in this book to identifying cultural capital or identifying all forms of capital with the state. Now, does he think capitalism should be overthrown then? Maybe he does. Okay, so I don't know, man, but he's more inside the sociology of how this means. But at a certain point, I'm almost there. This is the last paragraph of one of his lectures. After having worked a lot on the state, rereading today my article on symbolic power makes me see the extent to which I was myself a victim of state thought. I was not aware that I was writing an article on the state. I thought I was writing an article about symbolic power. I see this now as evidence of the extraordinary power of the state and state thought. Now, again, this is really ambiguous. What he's saying is that in my previous work on symbolic power and violence and whatever, I didn't emphasize the state nearly as much as I should have, because symbolic power cannot be described except by talking about the state. Or is he saying, I reread my own article and reread some of my own work on this, and I realized that I am the victim of state power, of state thought. I think like the state wants me to think. I've constructed this whole vision of the state. I've accepted this whole Hegelian vision of the state. And now, am I just, being subjected to this hallucination? Because he does think it's a fiction. But I think, it's a little hard to interpret, but I think, sadly, what he's saying there is that he should have emphasized that he could not really describe symbolic power or cultural capital and stuff without straight up appealing to the state. His view of the state, I said this already, the function of the state is to set up standardized vocabularies, language, to standardize the language, standardize the weights and measures, and standardize human identities. There's no conceiving. We conceive reality only through the state. And that's why I say this is awfully Hegelian. But at that moment where you go, I was rereading my own stuff this morning, my students, my graduate students, and I'm not sure that I'm not just, that my thought hasn't been distorted and controlled and articulated by state power. At least he's broaching some question like that, okay, which I really appreciate. Now, that's just one paragraph. And then he immediately goes back to the state is the universal, the state is legitimate. Maybe that's descriptive. People regard it as legitimate. Some do, some don't. He argues, and this is pretty Hegelian, that the people who reject the legitimacy of the state presuppose it. To which I might just say, the people who affirm the legitimacy of the state attack it implicitly. And these are both kind of true. If you feel like you have to affirm the legitimacy of state power pervading every aspect of every human being, or whatever, you must be worried that that there's an alternative or something, even though you've just eliminated them all. Bourdieu in this treatment, one thing is very meta-sociological. He's talking about the nature of sociology. And I think he comes very close here to saying that sociological data just is state stuff. Right? That there's no sociology without the state, because there's no society without the state, because there's no social without the state, etc., etc., etc. This is our universal bottom line reality. Now, by the same token, though, he's not necessarily giving straight up arguments that there ought to be a state agent under your bed, or whatever, like Plato would, or Hegel would probably, or, he's not straight up arguing for detailed totalitarian institutions. It's just that he seems to be presupposing that state institutions are reality shaping in this profound way, and this way that nothing else is reality shaping. So human life without the state is not conceivable, and even in individual life or whatever. All right, so I think that's a sort of a Hegelian hallucination. Many times I'm going what? You can't. You think the state is what? Oh my God! All right. I think as an anarchist or whatever, he really tries to annex every rejection of state power in any dimension, to state power. All right. You presuppose what you reject, but whatever, man. He's not going to get me with that shit. But what I'm going to say, is he should not really be engaged, especially in the first few pages of this thing, immediately with that a priori Hegel conception of the state, whether it's Weber or not. And let me say one thing about the Weber conception of the state as a monopoly of legitimate force. It's not a good definition. Legitimate is dispensable. If you go to an island and there's a bunch of people operating an effective monopoly of violence, that's the state of that island. Whether it's legitimate, whatever the fuck that means, different things for different people, all right? and in Bourdieu it means maybe imagined to be inevitable or legitimate. Uh, so, if we're defining the state, giving necessary and sufficient conditions for the use of the term as it's used in ordinary language, legitimate has nothing, okay? But legitimate is everything to Bourdieu. But it's an imaginary thing. Like, it's the way we inevitably think of the state, even if we reject it because we're crazy anarchists or whatever. But although he also says about himself that he has an anarchist temperament. And it's pretty transgressive work in a lot of ways. But I don't think he has an anarchist temperament. Not if the state is the universal and, is responsible for codifying our language, which is responsible for our consciousness and shit like this. Maybe the French do that, sort of. Although I'm really, like I say, I'm really into corrupting the French language. Pierre. It's one of the better books we've talked about, and one of the more interesting figures. But I think he's... Is he a descriptive or a normative totalitarian? That would be the way to get him out of this. Pierre Bourdieu.